everybody. Today we're going to be going over technical session number 4, going over motherboards. We're going to be talking about the different types of form factors, which is just a fancy way of saying the different shapes and sizes of motherboards. We're going to be talking about the fact that motherboards essentially are the backbone or nervous system of your computer. All communication has to travel through it. In order to get to the CPU and various components and things like that. It allows everything to talk to each other. We're going to become very familiar with the geography of a motherboard. We kind of started to dive into that on Wednesday, but we're going to be going a little more detail into that today. We're going to be talking about the key roles of the motherboard, be able to describe and identify components and typical interfaces found on your motherboard, aka the geography of it. We're going to be able to name the steps of installing a motherboard and using BIOS or Uefi to configure said motherboard, identify common pitfalls when installing a motherboard, and identify common problems that come up with motherboards, including overheating and power problems. And then we will briefly talk about how to solve common problems that come up with motherboards themselves. All right. BSMs we want to keep in mind with regards to this technical session, the adaptability. We are in an ever-changing environment dealing with hundreds of different types of devices and interfaces and things like that. We need to be able to kind of rise to the challenge, do research when necessary, and be problem solvers, be detectives, try to figure out, what it is that's causing these problems, work around those problems, and find creative solutions for them. And persistence. We don't, the best way to solve problems typically is not give up on them. Even if you yourself are unable to solve that problem, say you're working in tier 1, you're unable to solve this problem, and unfortunately you now have to pass it off to tier 2 because you got to get the customer taken care of and not take too much time. Well, you did your best, but one thing you now can do after the fact, go back and look in that ticket or talk to tier 2 and see what they did to actually solve this problem. Because if you understand what they did, you've now put another tool in your toolbox to be able to solve that problem the next time it comes in. And as an IT professional, each problem that we understand and know how to solve makes us even more valuable to our team. All right. So what exactly is a motherboard? Here it says it's also known as a MOBO, but outside of these presentations, I've never really heard anybody refer to it as a MOBO. I could be, wrong in that fact. There may be some people or some circles where they do call it that. I just never personally have heard it called that. It essentially itself provides the foundation for the PC, since it connects directly to all the pieces of hardware that are going to interface with it. It is a multi-layered circuit board containing copper paths called traces that carry signals and voltages across the board itself. Some layers carry data for the input and output, while other layers distribute the power from the power supply to the various components. And the interface to configure your motherboard and its settings and all that kind of fun stuff is the BIOS, or now more recently, the Uefi. All right. So they do vary in shape, but there is some standardization to it. So some of the larger ones, you'll see in gaming, PCs and more powerful PCs have a more rectangular shape. Then you get down into a little more square shapes with, common enterprise ones for standard office work, schools and stuff like that will typically use, the more square size ones. And then they get even smaller when you're talking about laptops, and then you get into tablets and mobile phones and all that kind of fun stuff. Each of these computers, so to speak, have their own types of motherboards. When you start getting into the mobile stuff like the laptops and below, the form factors become very proprietary to the particular computer you're talking about. So you're not going to be able to take a Dell motherboard out of a laptop and swap it over to a Mac. You know, they're going to have different shapes and uses and sizes and components that they access. So it becomes very proprietary. Now, when you're talking about desktops, the two most popular, you have the ATX and the macro ATX or micro ATX. Those tend to be pretty universal across the board. They have the same, you know, screw patterns, and you can move them from one case to another with little to no issue. And again, when you're talking about the size and shape of the motherboard, that is called the form factor. So that is the typical term that you will always hear. You'll hear it with regards to the shape and size of many different things. It's just a fancy way of saying shape and size, form factor. All right. The three main types that you'll typically hear about is the ATX, the micro ATX, and the ITX. The ITX isn't necessarily a specific type, but a family of types. The mini, the nano, the pico, and the mobile. There is a wonderful graph showing this in the book. Here on page 9 of the physical textbook. I don't know the actual page in the digital book, but it's like 3 or 4 pages in on chapter 1. They're talking about motherboards. So it's a nice little graph. It shows you the standard, the micro, the mini, the nano, and the pico all in one graph to kind of give you a comparison. Do you need to know the dimensions of them? No. However, understanding that the standard ATX itself, which is the larger of the two, or the larger of the family, I think there is another one that is larger than this that is typically used in high performance gaming PCs and stuff like that. I can't remember the acronym for it. Do you know it, Mark, off the top of your head?
I want to say macro, but let me check. I'll look for it.
But yeah, it's typically found in gaming PCs. It is a larger version of the standard ATX, and you do need a specialized case actually to handle that one. But most cases for towers or whatever will utilize the standard or the micro. These can actually be relatively interchangeable. It is an older board, Mark. So yeah, this is an older board. Typical, like if you're just doing a quick glance, if you see 4+ Pci slots, you're dealing with a standard ATX. Also, if it is rectangular in shape, not square, so if you see the 12 by 9 by 6, rectangular in shape, that is a standard ATX. If it is perfectly square, that is typically a micro or a mini. But the standard and the micro are typically what you would see in normal desktop computers. All right, questions so far? All right, so the type of motherboard you are using will determine the type of case, to a degree, the power supply you will need. But a lot of the components you're installing will also determine, because you want to be able to supply sufficient power to all the things you're going to be connecting. So whatever you're hooking up your computer also will help determine the power supply. The type and number of slots you will have with regards to RAM and Pci slots or AGP. Speed of the memory and the CPU you'll be allowed to use. Also, what chipsets they have and the compatibility for plug and play, or as it's often referred to, plug and pray. So it's kind of like we said, it's the backbone. Everything is built on top of this. So if you want to run a certain CPU, you need to find out what motherboards are compatible with that and then determine which one will meet your needs and build up from there. Or if you want to use a certain type of motherboard, you would start with that and then build up from there. So expansion slots and sockets. So we have our RAM slots right here. Yes, there are only 3 on this particular one, but you can see many, many more. And your CPU. Who can tell me who's the fun manufacturer of that CPU right there? And how do we know?
Intel?
It is an Intel.
Thank you.
How do we know?
A lot of the little transistor, I guess I don't know if I call that transistors, but little, I don't know what that's called.
Go with pins if you want.
Pins, yeah.
So the pins themselves are on the motherboard. The chipset itself is flat and it sits on top of those pins. So Intel, which is a LAN grid array, LGA, thank you, Glean. And then AMD is a pin grid array where you see the pins sticking out of the microchip itself, and then they will go into slots in the motherboard. So looking at the motherboard itself, even if there's no documentation or what have you, you at least know what manufacturer of chip you're going to need right off the bat. And as we said, our RAM modules, which can work in single, double, and triple channel, where the banks can work independently or with each other, depending on how you have them set up within the BIOS or UEFI. Yes, Stephen.
What are the other ones you said? You said Intel is
LAN grid array.
Intel.
And just if you remember, it's LAN because it's flat, like the land.
Okay.
And then you have AMD, which is the other major manufacturer, which has a PGA or pin grid array, which we'll be getting into with CPUs. We haven't gotten to CPUs yet. I think that we'll be getting into that tomorrow, which is a pin grid array. So there's a bunch of pins that stick up from it.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
Another way to remember, Marvin kind of told us this, and it kind of stuck with us last class. When you think of Intel, LGA, there's an L, Intel, LGA. That's how you can, that's another way that you can differentiate between the two of them if you're not sure. That's a good way to remember.
Yeah, he had a lot of those neat little memory tricks. The man was building memory palaces before he knew what they were. Yes, I can go back to the previous slide real quick. I think got that. Let me know when you're good on this slide. All right. All right, next. Expansion slots, PCI, or peripheral component interconnect. At first, it had roughly about a 32-bit data path. And remember, a bit is a single 1 or a 0. It required roughly about 5 volts of power to a adapter card itself and operated around 33 megahertz. Do you need to know all of that? No, not typically. To understand, it was one of the initial things that we used to connect slot components to the computer, you know, things like NIC cards and all that stuff, sound cards, all that stuff, not graphics cards, but all that stuff did not come standard on typical PC. So you'd have to add this stuff aftermarket. So if you worked in IT, say back in the 90s, at a big office, if you got a whole new shipment of computers in, you would have to install NIC cards in every single one of those computers before any of them could hook up to the internet. You know, and this would require your slot components and stuff like that to do this. So it's not a particularly fast interface. It's one of the first ones that they had. And it was just kind of setting the stage. Now, PCI version 2, the 64-bit, so doubled the speed, and then actually lowered the power requirement. So it only needed 3.3 volts. And it doubled the data throughput on the bus, which are, how much data can be translated at any given time. Yes, we will be dropping these slides, Venkata, the student pay slides in the Slack. We do that with every presentation, and the videos will be uploaded to YouTube. I've created the playlist for this particular cohort. It's already live on the channel, and the 3 technical sessions from last week are there as well. So now, how do we protect, from putting the wrong card into the wrong voltage slot? Well, thankfully, they thought of this and they added notches into the cards, making it near impossible to put the wrong type of card into the wrong type of slot. It just won't fit. So they've moved the position of the slots based off of that. Also, they did this in RAM with regards to generation of the SODIMMs and the DDR RAM. They moved the position of the slots to make it pretty impossible to be able to put a wrong generation or wrong type of card into the wrong slot. Yes, Cynthia.
Now they have it, so they have little stickers on the actual stick. So if you don't know where it goes, you could just always read the stick, even if it didn't. But like Kelly is saying, you can't put it in because of that little break in between the bottom of the chip or the module, or wherever you're putting it in. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll show you a better close-up of that when we get into RAM this afternoon. They have a pretty good visual on like the various generations of RAM and where that slot location is. But yes, they do typically have a sticker on there that'll tell you the generation, PC speed, all that kind of fun stuff on the side of the RAM chips before you install them, so that you can verify it if you so choose. All right. Conventional PCI is no longer evolving. It is a legacy technology. I'll get you in just 1 second there, Steve. It is a legacy technology, no longer evolving. It is kind of being phased out because the PCIe is significantly faster, more effective. And even the AGP, which was the bridging technology between PCI and PCIe, even that is starting to be phased out. Yes, Steve.
What do you mean by notch? What is a notch?
Well, so on the bottom of a RAM module, let's use that as an example. So you have a RAM module like this. On the bottom of it, there may be a little notch cut out of it like that. So like little spot cut out of it, and they'll have like a little piece of plastic in the slot so that it matches up with this. And then when you have the next generation, which say like a generation 3 or something like that, when you're going in, the notch will be in a different location like that. So I could not put this RAM blade, so I can say if this is a 2 and this is a 3, my writing is terrible. I could not put a 3 in a 2 slot. I cannot put a 2 in a 3 slot. And this is based in RAM. It's based off of generation. So they move where that little notch or slot is cut out of the board itself. And they have a piece added inside the little slot on the board so that you can't put it in. If you try, it'll just kind of rock back and forth and it won't sit in there. Make sense?
Perfect.
Cool.
Right here, Steve. This is how it looks.
There you go.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So here's a representation of what the slot looks like. You can see the there we go. See the notches right here, and then based off of generation, you can see it here and here, which would separate it based off of voltage. Same here and here. So those will always be present in the slots so that you do not incorrectly place, like say, a 3.3 volt into a 5 volt slot. Yes, Cynthia.
Is there such a thing as a 12-volt slot?
For a PCI, I do not believe so, because you would do an additional power. There actually would be an additional power connector to go, because like for graphics cards and stuff like that, they require significantly more power. And there actually is a direct connection from the power supply to the actual graphics card direct, rather than going through the motherboard itself.
Thank you.
So to my knowledge, all PCI cards are typically 3.3 or 5. All right. Pci X, or Peripheral Component Interconnect Extended, offers a high-speed alternative to PCI, uses 64-bit data path, and had essentially 3 major revisions. But this was typically focused in the enterprise environments on the server market. So it was significantly more expensive than you would want to typically deal with on a personal computer itself. All right, for laptops, they have the mini PCI, which is essentially a smaller version for all-in-one computers and laptops itself, and operated on small form factor motherboards. Typically set up for low power consumption, and unlike a typical PC, when you put in a expansion card on a PC, if this was your motherboard, the expansion card would go like at a perpendicular angle, 90 degrees straight down in it. If you go into a laptop, you have your motherboard, the cards actually are designed to lay flat. So they may go in like this and then lay down. RAM modules do this in PCs because space is at a premium. So, which is why many of the components outside of RAM tend to be relatively permanent inside laptops. You aren't necessarily going to be upgrading a lot of your components internally. But it also creates another issue with cooling with laptops, which is why you should never have laptops sitting on pillows or on your lap or any of that stuff, because you're blocking those precious vents on the underside of that laptop and will inevitably fry that computer. I had a coworker in the transportation business who was notorious for killing laptops because he would just slap the laptop closed, throw it in his bag and walk out, never turn the computer off. So the computer's actually running in an insulated bag in Florida with no AC in the car, driving home over an hour. So needless to say, he fried at least 3 to 4 laptops in an 18-month period and couldn't figure out why it kept happening to him. So it's very, very important to make sure you're not clogging or blocking the vents on these computers, because they do need to breathe. All right. Questions so far? Comments?
Yeah, I have one. So do you prefer to turn off your laptop every time after class when you're not using it?
Okay. It's not a matter of when I'm using it, when I'm not. It's a matter of when I'm transporting it. So, I mean, I have my PC running almost all the time because it's also the server for my house. All my multimedia, everything runs through my PC. So I have it running all the time. I very, very seldom ever turn it off. Laptops, if you're not moving them constantly, just like a desktop, it's not necessarily going to hurt it to have it running a lot of the time. Yeah, been on Plex for years, Mark. But
Turn off my laptop.
But the big thing with laptops is just like if you're transporting it and you're putting it in a laptop bag, at least turn it off, because otherwise it's going to keep running. It's going to need that ventilation and cooling, and you're going to basically nuke it. And please, please, if you're going from one room to another, 2 hands, not one hand on the edge of that laptop, 2 hands, because when you have one hand on it, it flexes. And over time, that can cause components to become dislodged or even crack and, you know, damage the casings. So it just seems like it's easy just to kind of pick it up and carry it like, you know, one hand into the other room. But that is a surefire way to damage a laptop over time.
So pretty much you don't want it overheating when you're transporting or leaving it somewhere where it's hot.
Yeah. So if you have it like on your dining room table and you have it sitting on like a placemat or on a tablecloth and that tablecloth is blocking airflow, that's bad over time. So if you have it just on like a flat table, it can breathe quite well. So it's not going to harm it. If you're going to have it on your lap, they actually make little trays that actually have fans on the underside of them that will draw the air out from underneath there, and you can have it comfortably on your lap. But it's a specially designed flat tray that's going to improve ventilation. You don't want it directly on your lap and then or on like a towel or a pillow or any kind of stuff like that, or on your bed. You want it on like a hard surface where it can ventilate properly. Otherwise, it can damage the computer.
Yeah, because on a Google Chrome, I have a Chrome laptop, and I really don't know where is the fan or anything. Like, it's never hot.
It's typically on the bottom. There's like these tiny little slits on the very bottom of the PC, and that's where you'll see it typically.
Yeah, on the bottom or in the back.
Yeah, or in the back. I'm not overly familiar. I haven't used many Chromebooks. I think my friend of mine had one. I've used it a couple times, but I've never like worked on one, like hardware wise.
I think it's coming through the speaker. I don't know. I really can't see it, to be honest.
If you don't have like your AC on, you can actually kind of like, if you hear the fan kick on, you can kind of run your hand over it and you can feel where the air is going in or out. So, but we'll get to that when we get to laptops, mobile devices and stuff like that. So
Okay.
we will get there. All right. Next, the AGP, or advanced or accelerated graphics ports. I always want to call it advanced graphics port for some reason. Accelerated graphics port. The bridging technology between the PCI and the PCIe, which first allowed us to utilize graphics cards in computers to improve the built-in graphics that already came with it. They typically on the motherboard are going to be brown in color and slightly offset from your normal PCI slots. Remember, the original PCI tends to be this cream color here. So it's like off-white cream color, and then your PCI or your AGPs are brownish in color. Again, unless you have a gaming PC that has chosen specific colors for aesthetic reasons. So this is connected directly to the North Bridge itself, which allows very fast communication to the CPU. The Pci slots are connected to the South Bridge, which is where a lot of your input-output devices like keyboards and mouses and stuff like that, peripherals, kind of hook up that don't require super fast connections. So that's why you wouldn't typically do a graphics card through an old PCI. PCIe integrated it directly into the North Bridge, which is geographically close to the CPU, allowing for much faster transmission and allowed us to start upgrading the graphics on the computers themselves. Yes, Cynthia.
Let me make sure I got the architecture right. The old one, the PCI, which is the cream, it was put on the North Bridge, and the PCI was put on the South Bridge, but the modern ones, the PCI is put on the North Bridge.
Okay, so the old cream color PCI, that's the original expansion slots, the PCI, the ones that originally ran at 32 bits and then 64 bits. So those went through the South Bridge. S for slow, South Bridge. So S for South, S for slow. That's going to be your slowest connection to the CPU itself. So that's typically where your mouse or your keyboard, all that kind of fun stuff. I don't care how fast you type, you're not going to overwhelm the South Bridge to where you're going to get lag into the CPU. It can process it way faster than you can type. But for things like graphics cards, going in through the South Bridge, you're going to have such noticeable lag, it's going to be virtually useless.
So North Bridge would be the best place to put it.
Yes.
It's a lot faster.
And how we can point out the North Bridge, it is geographically close. Like it is the closest large chipset to the CPU itself.
Cool. Thank
Although
you.
nowadays they're actually integrating the North Bridge into the CPU. So, but for the purposes of the A+, the North Bridge is your large chipset closest to your CPU. That's how you can identify it quickly when you're looking at a motherboard itself. But we'll show you another motherboard. You'll get plenty of practice labeling motherboards. Mark was severely tired of labeling motherboards by the time he took his 1001. He was so thrilled he didn't have to do that again until we asked him to come here, and you know, now he's got to do it again. But so the AGP allowed us that much faster communication into the CPU, allowing for graphics cards to kind of come into play. Yes, Stephen.
So you said the North Bridge will be closest to the CPU?
Yes, it'll be the large chipset closest to the CPU. I'll show you when we get to like we have a top-down picture of a motherboard, and we have a Jamboard of a motherboard, which is awesome. So we'll probably be breaking you guys up into small groups a little bit later to label a motherboard. No notes, just to give it a shot and get your first crack at practice with it. So AGP, there we go. Now, all right, getting into the PCIe, which is the most modern iteration of it thus far. Fastest communication speeds. It is a high-speed alternative to the PCI and AGP, and essentially is replacing all of those because PCI and AGP are kind of being phased out at this point. Uses a serial bus, which allows for two-way communication, which is much faster than a parallel bus, which allows for only one way and then one back. Comes in 4 different slot sizes, depending on the number of lanes called PCI Express. We have by 1, by 4, by 8, and by 16. Visually, you can spot these based off of the size. By 1, annotation, there we go. By 1 will be like a small little box, kind of like this. By 4 will be a little bit bigger. By 8, bigger than that. And then by 16 will be the largest. And these are typically blue or black in color. So by 1, by 4, by 8, and by 16. Most commonly, the PCIe 16 is used for your video cards because it requires the fastest, most direct communication. Did you have another question, Stephen, or are you just kind of hanging out like that?
Yes, I do have another question.
Okay.
What is a serial bus and what is a parallel bus?
Those are those copper lines that you see drawn on a motherboard, and that is what allows the communication to go through. Parallel bus allows for, like, I think power on one, data on the other. Serial allows for both.
Cool.
So when we see the top-down view, I'll show you the lines. It's like, it's almost like you're looking top-down on a city, and the buses or those lines are like the roads that interconnect all the buildings together. And like a parallel bus would be like one-way streets, and serial bus would be your normal thoroughfares.
Oh, thank you. All right, cool.
All right, any questions? Yes, Cynthia.
So I just want to make sure I'm clear. So can I say that serial bus is bidirectional and parallel bus is unidirectional?
Yes, I believe
Okay,
that
cool.
is accurate.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, can you say that again, Cynthia?
That the serial bus is bidirectional and the parallel bus is unidirectional.
So parallel goes one way, serial goes both ways.
Yeah, bidirectional is going both ways. Sorry about that. And uni is means one direction.
Yes, Mark.
Just a quick question. PCI Gen 1 and Gen 2, they're both South Bridge, or can they be both South and North?
To my knowledge, they are only South Bridge because the AGP was the first to be connected to the North Bridges, which is what made it such a jump in such an important jump in technological speed, because that is what allowed for the graphics card, was the AGP. Now the PCIe is also North Bridge.
Got it. Thank you.
Mhm. All right, so here's the ones in black here. These are your PCIe's. The cream is your old school PCI. It does not have an AGP on here where you can see it. So you got a by 1 right here, which is, you know, the small one. This one here is a by 4. They don't have a by 8 for us to look at, but you have the by 16 right here. All right, chipset. So chipset essentially means integrated chips that are built already into the motherboard themselves. So every motherboard itself has its own chipset, or it has one or more built in that support the various CPUs that are interfacing with it, as well as all the other devices that you're going to be connecting to it as well. So the most common set of chips are the North Bridge and the South Bridge, which we had talked about. North Bridge, that is the highest speed connection. So that's where you want your RAM connected. That's where you want your PCIe slots connected, all of that right in there to that North Bridge, because you want as fast of an interchange between them and the CPU as possible. And then you get to the South Bridge. That's where you're a lot, you know, slower speed things need to be connected, like your hard drives, your USB slots, expansion devices, all your peripherals, even your, you know, webcams, microphones, headsets, speakers, all that would go through the South Bridge itself. All the input output devices that you would be utilizing, because they don't need super high speed connection, you can run them through there. So that's typically where you would run things through. If it needs very high speed, fast response, fast connection, goes to the North Bridge. Anything slower goes through the South. So S for South, S for slow. All right.
And you said South Bridge connects the input and output devices?
Yes. So your speakers, microphones, all that kind of fun stuff. So I/O devices, input, output.
I have a question, please.
Yes.
So when you say when it comes to being the slow is the south, obviously the north is fast. So what determines their slow and fast?
Well, it's what reaction time they need with interfacing with the CPU.
Okay, thank you.
So the RAM itself is like your temporary storage for the CPU while it's running computations. It's handing stuff off to the RAM so that the RAM can hold on to it while the CPU is working on other things. So there's a constant and, you know, high-speed interchange going on between the CPU and the RAM. So it needs a really fast connection. So all the RAM must go through the North Bridge. Now, PCIe slots, those typically would be your graphics cards and fun stuff like that. So they need a really high-speed, low latency connection. So they also need to go through the North Bridge. Keyboard, again, even if I'm typing 300 words a minute, it's not going to overwhelm the South Bridge's communication with the motherboard, because there's no way I can run fast enough to where I'm going to overwhelm that. So your input output devices are going to be slower connections. They don't necessarily need that super high speed connection. Yes, Cynthia.
Can I make the correlation at the North Bridge, because it has the higher speed and it has to calculate a lot quicker, that it takes up more voltage?
Not necessarily.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, that's okay. We don't have to explain it. That was just because I know that's not relevant now, but I kind of it just kind of popped up just to see if that was true or not, but it makes sense now.
Well, I mean, it's actually, it's more so in this case, it's distance versus voltage. Because, I mean, it's only like a couple inches, but that is, you know, a long way away when you're talking about latency in the, nanoseconds realm. So the fact that you're geographically closer, this would be like me, here in Jacksonville trying to go to Atlanta versus Jacksonville, Florida, trying to go to Atlanta versus trying to go to New York City. It's that distance is going to create more time, more lag.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks.
So it's more of a function of distance rather than voltage. So, Stephen.
Yeah, I see that over here for the North Bridge. It says CPU, RAM, and video. What do you
Mhm.
mean
What do you mean? What?
by video? What is connected? What is video?
That would be like your graphics cards, your, stuff like that. That's what they mean by video specifically. But even so, the integrated graphics on the motherboard itself also runs through the North Bridge. It's just not super powerful.
Can you say that one more time?
So even so, the integrated graphics on the motherboard, so the basic graphics that you would have standard on your PC, even that runs through the North Bridge because it has to have that fast connection and low latency, low lag, or delay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So you can identify these chipsets. They tend to be a little bit larger and have heat sinks on top of them. So if you look over here on this side piece, here's your CPU. Right next to it, geographically close, there is your North Bridge right there. And then a little bit further away, smaller heat sink. That would be your South Bridge over here. So looking down on this chipset, CPU right next to it, North Bridge, further away, South Bridge. And they're going to be your largest heat sinks outside of the CPU itself. So we're just going to look at this real quick and we'll take a quick break after this. This is just kind of a graphical representation of it. You have your CPU right here. The closer you are geographically to the CPU, the faster speed is required. So you have your clock generator, which determines how the information is going to be transmitted through the motherboard itself. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. And then you have the North Bridge or memory controller hub. This is where you have your Pcie slots right here, or your memory slots for your RAM. Now, go to your South Bridge. You have your old Pci slots, your input output devices. You have your IDEs, which are like your floppy drives and stuff like that. Your SATA hard drives, which are going to be significantly faster. You got your Ethernet or network NIC cards, audio codecs, your CMOS memory, things like that, all running through your South Bridge. And then you have your Super IO, which is your input output devices. Those are all your outside serial ports, parallel ports, all that kind of fun stuff, keyboard, mouse. And then your flash ROM for your BIOS, which is not to be, don't confuse this ROM with RAM. So this is for your BIOS itself. Yes, Jessica.
Excuse me. In the picture you were going by for the North and South Bridge, just to confirm, the North Bridge, would it be those two sections there or just the one closest to the CPU?
The two sections there. It's probably two heat sinks sitting right on top of it.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to confirm.
So yeah. This right here would be your North Bridge. This right here would be South Bridge. And then CPU, which you cannot read because the socket is yellow.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I got a question.
Okay.
So in a way, does the heat sink, let's see some heat sinks right here. Does that kind of separate north to south?
So here's your heat sink here. This So I don't understand your question. Can you ask that
Yeah,
one more
'cause I'm
time?
looking at these little blue ones right next to the onto the left.
Mhm.
Are those heat sinks right there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which one? What? You're talking about these over
Like
here?
these little ones. Yeah, those little ones right there.
Yeah, those are different chipsets, but yes, those are heat sinks on top of them as well. This is why you're looking for the larger heat sinks right here.
So the heat sink would always be on the north bridge, in a way.
Yes, there will always be a heat sink on your north bridge. But you're going to be looking for a larger chipset. It's going to be basically the next largest to your CPU.
Oh, nice.
And then it'll be geographically close. So that would be your north bridge there. This one is also significantly larger than the others. And that would be your south bridge right there. But we'll see a few other examples of this and you'll kind of get the feel for it. Be able to point it out pretty quickly. But inside a computer and even inside the chips, there are heat sinks everywhere because they are constantly looking for ways to control heat. Even inside the CPU, inside the chip, there are heat sinks internally in there as well to try to control it as much as they can. So they put them wherever they can to try to, you know, cool it off as quickly as they can to try to keep things running efficiently. Any questions on this so far before we take a quick break? All right, next, this is kind of looking a little bit more into it. As we've kind of stated, in order to make things run faster and more efficient, first we try to integrate it down into the motherboard, and then we try to integrate it closer and closer to the CPU, and eventually integrating it into the CPU itself. More so nowadays, you're seeing the north bridge being absorbed by the CPU, so that it allows for significantly faster communication between the CPU and the primary components like your video cards and your RAM and stuff like that. And then the south bridge is going to be visible on the motherboard, and they've kind of changed the name to the Platform Controller Hub, or PCH, but that is just another name for the south bridge. Questions so far? So as the technology becomes smaller and it needs faster communications, and this goes with almost everything, first thing we try to do is integrate it into the motherboard, and then over time integrate it into the CPU. Kind of like NIC cards nowadays are integrated directly into the CPU, and many times Wi-Fi NICs and things like wireless NICs and things like that as well. Makes it a lot easier. It's just directly integrated, and the only time you'll need to add a NIC typically is if the one on the motherboard goes bad, breaks, and you can do a workaround by installing a NIC card itself, or the motherboard you've purchased does not have one integrated, which, depending on what you get, sometimes the gaming motherboards don't have the NIC integrated. They need to be added aftermarket. But a lot of your standard enterprise ones already have it installed. So next, the clock generator. Yes, Mark.
All right, I'm just want to be clear on North Bridge and South Bridge. I didn't see the hard drive listed. What would that use? Would that be
Hard
north
drive
and
would be
south?
under the south bridge, because that would be an input-output device. If we look on the components here, you see the IDE and the SATA. The SATA would be your hard drive right here.
I see it there. Okay.
So
Got it.
great diagram to take a quick snapshot, like screenshot of, because it kind of just shows the bulk of things, how they kind of connect. And this is more a logical diagram rather than a physical diagram. But it just kind of shows how all the pieces kind of fit together. So if you want to grab a quick screen grab of this, it's a good one to have on hand. Yes, Cynthia.
Can you go the 3 and 3 chipset? I have a question on the other picture. The
Yep.
last picture.
Did you have another question, Mark, or are you good? All right, does everybody have a screen grab of this? All right, move up to 3 of 3. Yes, Cynthia.
So when I see the Intel, the CPU, and then I
Mhm.
see the Intel X99 chipset, the chipset is already integrated onto the motherboard. When it says chipset, like if you're reading like a a diagram
Schematic.
like this, a schematic, thank you. So the Intel XS9 chipset, the way I see this laid out, this would be the south bridge, because I see that all the input and output devices would be for the south bridge. I know that the north bridge is for higher, faster speed.
Well, this is showing a more modern setup. So yes,
Okay.
this Intel X99, that, yes, you are absolutely correct. That is the south bridge.
Right.
Because in more modern iterations, the north bridge itself is being integrated into the CPU. So they have moved it onto the CPU chip rather than having a separate chipset on the board.
Okay.
So they were able to get it as physically close as you could possibly get, meaning on top of. So that would be the fastest communication they could possibly get. It's directly on top of the chipset. It's in there,
Got it.
it can't get any faster than that. And so the next chipset you see outside would be your south bridge and the input output. So good observation. Yes, that is correct. The Intel X99 is the south bridge.
Thank you very much.
But they also call it the platform controller hub. That is the other name they will call it.
Good to know. Thank you.
All right. So keeping time. Computers keep time, much the way many of us have for quite a long period. They actually use quartz crystals. So they actually take quartz crystals and they solder them down to the motherboard. Why do we use quartz? Because when you put an electrical charge through quartz, it vibrates in a predictable and consistent manner. So it is, like a metronome. You put a charge through it, it vibrates at a very, very consistent and predictable speed. They call this the piezoelectric effect. No, you do not need to know that. But that is the particular effect they're speaking of with these actual crystals that they put on the board, so that everything on the board is operating off of the exact same clock. So this is going to determine the pulses of bits going through the motherboard. So think of it mostly like a metronome. So each pass of the metronome, it will send a pulse of bits, ones and zeros. They can send one through each bus per pulse of the clock. So it'd be like boom, 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 1, 0, 0, 1. So each pulse of the clock, it can send one pulse of a 1 or a 0 through the bus. What determines when that pulse is sent and how many can be sent is the crystal quartz that is set into the motherboard, soldered in. You can see it right here, and that is the clock generator on your motherboard. So every component attached to that computer is all operating off of that same timing. Because if everybody's kind of operating on their own speed, we have data collisions. And that brings things to a halt. So everybody has to be operating off the same clock, the same speed, the same metronome. And that is the clock generator itself. Questions? All right. Next.
I'm sorry, Kelly,
BIOS.
could you repeat that? Where you said every component runs
Yes.
and moves basically off the clock generator,
So the clock generator basically sets the tempo
the tempo.
for the entire computer. Everything connected to it is going to base what it does based off of this tempo, whatever pace is set by the clock generator itself.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Next, the BIOS, or basic input output services. Serves three purposes. Serves as data and instruction codes that enable the CPU to communicate and manage devices such as your keyboard, mouse, hard drive, memory, monitor, all that. Your motherboard, when it is first installed, it has a basic list of instructions for hundreds of different types of items. And what it may allow is just basic communication. So it's like, okay, I know that's a keyboard. I know it's in QWERTY configuration. It has, X number of, keys on it. And so it will allow for basic communication to that keyboard. And it tells the computer where it is. It can receive instructions from it. Same thing with a mouse, same thing with your hard drive, same thing with your operating system. It tells everything where to look. So that's number two. It looks for its booting processes. Where do I go for an operating system? Do I go to the optical drive? Do I go to a hard drive? Do I go to, a USB? Where do I go? Do I go over the network? The BIOS tells the computer where to go looking for the operating system and boot instructions of how it's going to start up. And you don't have to give it just one. You could set up a hierarchy. So you go here first, here second, here third, here fourth. But these basic instructions, like on your keyboard, your mouse, all that kind of fun stuff, it allows the computer to kind of get started. And then once you get the operating system up and running, you can download the additional drivers that will give you complete functionality of the devices that you have connected. One of the things I like to typically point to on that is printers. So you may have an HP 5325J printer. You plug that into your computer. It's like, well, I don't have that particular printer, but I have an HP 5000, which is a similar series. So it'll be able to do basic functions. It'll be able to talk to the computer, print basic text, but then you go out and you download the additional drivers. Now all of a sudden it can print in color, it can do pictures, it can scan, it can do all this other stuff. So it has a general list of, devices that it can communicate with. And this is typically found in your BIOS. Yes, Glean.
Printers. Does this mean that we also have to understand how laser, inkjet, and dot matrix printer works, and the orders and everything else that it goes into?
How are we going to have to understand how those things work?
Well, is that going to be covered also through this?
Oh yes.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
That was Mark's favorite, absolute
yeah.
favorite technical session was printers.
Oh my God, I hate
Oh
it.
yeah.
I will tell you this. You will encourage your office to go paperless after this session, or after this this course. Most people do not like the printer section. Because yes, we do have to have a good understanding of printers, but we will get to that. I think the day before Christmas, so it'll be a nice little Christmas send-off for everyone. But yeah, we will get into printers a little bit later. But kind of back to this, the BIOS is kind of your basic instructions to be able to communicate with all this stuff. Then next, it's where do I go looking for my my operating system, and then also the BIOS can change your motherboard settings, date, time, port configurations, boot order, all that kind of fun stuff can be configured within the BIOS itself. In fact, if you start up your computer and it says it cannot locate date and time, that's an instant key to go looking, to your Cmos battery. Hey, I know this is no longer functioning. So that is going to be one of your troubleshooting things with regards to the motherboard. We'll get into that a little bit later. We'll talk about it. But all this stuff is stored in the flash chip, the BIOS, on your motherboard. So CMOS battery right here, and your flash ROM, or your firmware chip, excuse me. The battery will keep your settings, so to speak, date and time, all the fancy drivers and stuff you've downloaded, all that will be stored in the flash memory of the BIOS. And then you have the firmware chip itself, which has the unchanged instructions, or the basic BIOS operating system. The battery here supplies low-level power to the RAM that holds the settings changes and all that stuff, because it's stored on volatile memory. And as we talked about on Wednesday, volatile memory essentially means when it loses power, everything is erased. So everything is gone off of volatile memory if it ever loses power. So this battery keeps that nice little trickle of power to the BIOS RAM, so that it won't lose your settings. If you ever lose your settings, it typically means this little coin battery, this little CMOS battery is dead and needs to be replaced.
How long do those batteries last?
It depends, but you probably get like 2 years out of them typically. And they typically are all the same size. So if you're a technician working in an office, these batteries are dirt cheap. Keep about 5 or 10 of them in your bag, so that if one goes bad, you can just pop it out real quick, throw another one in, you're good to go. It's like a 5-minute operation to get one swapped out. Yes, Cynthia.
The flash memory, the read-only memory, is that considered non-volatile or volatile? Like,
Well, the BIOS itself is kept on a flash read-only memory. And then you have your settings, which would be on the flash RAM or the BIOS RAM.
okay.
And that is stored on volatile memory. And unfortunately, now the read-only is kind of a misnomer, because read-only means you're not allowed to update it, change it, or whatever. But now we know we can update around, BIOS systems and stuff like that by flashing the BIOS. So
That's
is
why I said wrong.
technically not in the read-only memory category anymore, though they still call it that.
Okay, cool.
All right, go ahead, Joseph.
Yes, when the CMOS battery dies, between the time it dies and the time you will change it, will you lose data or settings?
Settings, yes. Data, not necessarily. What it is it'll be kind of an annoyance. Every time you turn your computer on, it says your computer does not have date and time. And so it'll make you go into the BIOS and set your date and time. You set your date and time, and then you're good. And then you turn your computer off and you turn it back on, and then you have to do that again. Because when you turn off the computer, it lost power because the battery's dead. So that's like your surefire way of knowing that a CMOS battery is dead, is when you turn on the computer and it gives you that black screen and says, unable to detect date and time or something like that. And that just tells you right away, I got to go in and change my CMOS battery.
I got a question.
Go ahead.
So when that battery dies and then I put a new one in, do I have to put the time again? Like the date?
Yes.
Manually?
Yeah, reset it. Yeah.
And we're not talking about the time in your operating system. This is the time that your computer keeps. So this would be for logs and all that kind of fun stuff. Because you can make the operating, your Windows operating system time can be different than your BIOS time. You can manually make them different. But with regards to log keeping and stuff like that, that is done from the BIOS clock. Why doesn't the board just pull from the PSU? Good question. Honestly, I don't know, but it's also, you're not always plugged in.
Right.
So you may, especially if it's a laptop or, you moved from chair to chair, it doesn't pull from that. I don't know. I mean, maybe they just don't want to have an extra connection inside the computer because it's already been remedied with the CMOS battery itself. Also, it could be a case that it is a fail-safe to let you know that something needs to be repaired versus it being connected to the CPU and then you not being able to troubleshoot it unless you move the computer. So if you get that error only every time you move a computer, then that issue could be persistent for quite some time. Also, there's security reasons for it too. So, but we'll get into that as well. Yes, Karen.
I wanted to ask, you said the flash ROM is the firmware chip.
So you have the firmware chip right here, which is your
Right.
BIOS. That's the ROM read-only menu.
Okay.
Memory, not menu. Ah, I'm hungry. So read-only memory. So if we
Okay.
go back, oops, no, don't do that. No. Okay, here we go. Wrong back button. So let's see here. So there's your system firmware, your BIOS, UEFI. There's the flash ROM, which is your BIOS. That's the same thing.
Okay. Okay.
But there is
All
a
right.
RAM component stored on another little chip, and that is volatile memory that is stored or powered by that CMOS battery.
Okay. Thank you.
So, all right. Now, the fancy new upgraded version of BIOS.
I have
Yes, Cynthia.
I just want to make sure one more last question about the firmware. Now, when you update it, you meaning like you can go to the manufacturer and like download a driver to update the BIOS?
Well,
Firmware?
yes, because they might come up with a new version of that firmware of the BIOS that is more secure, may have more bells and whistles, things like that. So these do come out. They don't come out very often, but they do come out.
Okay.
And you can choose to upgrade to the new, more secure version of the BIOS or whatever they've done to change it, or you can stick with the one you have. But if you choose to update it, that's called flashing the BIOS, and you're actually updating and changing this supposed read-only memory. So, and that's what we were talking about last week. If anything goes wrong when you're flashing the BIOS, any kind of power surge, anything, your device essentially becomes just a very large paperweight.
Thank you. That makes sense. All right, thanks.
So, all right. Here we go. So BIOS, really great, awesome thing to begin with, but like all things, it needs an upgrade. So more modern computers will use the UEFI, which is the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, or the upgraded version of BIOS. Quick way to know whether or not you're operating in BIOS or UEFI. If you can use a mouse, it's UEFI. If you have to use your arrows to get around, it's BIOS. Also, UEFI is a GUI interface, much more graphical. They have some that are really cool looking nowadays, and you got all kinds of bells and whistles where you can, monitor all the stuff going on inside your computer, your clock speeds. You can overclock your CPUs. You can control your fans. Like tons of stuff you can do now in the UEFI that you weren't really able to do in the BIOS. You could overclock in the BIOS. It's easier to do in the UEFI. All right. Now, BIOS was limited in the fact that it could only support system files smaller than 2.2 terabytes. UEFI can go much larger than that. It can support 32-bit or 64. BIOS can only support 32. And it supports a GUI interface to configure your CMOS, where BIOS does not. It looks like very, very old DOS. Questions so far? We will have pictures of both. And there are fun labs and test out where you get to play around with both. So here's an example of UEFI. It's all fancy. It's got the clocks, it's got the pictures. You can actually use your mouse to click on stuff. You can adjust fan speeds, voltages. You can do a whole ton of stuff in here. BIOS. Let's see if the next one is BIOS. Nope, didn't have the BIOS. Where is it? See if they have a BIOS picture. Nope. I think we'll get to BIOS a little bit later. So this is a basic example of what your UEFI looks like. We will go through BIOS I believe, in an entire session of that. I think, Mark, do we have that? Was it a whole T session, or was it just part of one?
I think it was part of one. Part of one.
Okay, so we will get into actual like just plain BIOS, and don't worry, you'll get plenty of opportunity to play around with it.
Right.
So trust me when I say test out is your friend. You are going to get a lot of bang for your buck messing around in there, playing with the simulators and the labs in there. It's a lot of hands-on experience, especially with the software and stuff like that. So I highly encourage using the time in there if you can. All right. So various types of connectors you may see on a motherboard. So you have this one right here in the blue. That is your IDE or floppy drive. Another word for it may be PATA, P-A-T-A. And it is a wide flat ribbon that connects to it. So it's not a super fast connection, but this will be to, like I said, your hard drives, floppy drives typically. So IDE, PATA, or floppy drive would typically be what you would see connected with that. This is one of the most identifiable connectors on the board. That is your power supply, and that would be like a 20-pin connector or a 20+4. So it's 20 or 24, but typically the 4 will break off and plug into the CPU connector on the board itself. But again, you will have practice with that on a lab tonight. Fan connectors, there are different kinds. You have 2, 3, and 4-pin connectors. Here's the beautiful part. If you have a 4-pin connector and a 3-pin, like if you had a 4-pin connector right here, but only 3 pins on the motherboard, just plug it in. You don't need an adapter, none of that fun stuff. You just plug it in. Because on the fan connectors, you have the power, which is, you have 2 of them for the power, 1 for on and off, and then the 4th one would be for the speed of the fan. So if you have 3 pins on the board and a 4-pin connector and you plug it in, only thing you lose is speed. Yes, Steven.
Yeah, that was the one thing I was confused about when I was doing the lab. There was a front fan, and there was a rear fan.
Yes.
Fan. I couldn't tell the difference by looking at it. I looked in the front and they all had 3. I looked at
Yeah, well, I mean, what it's going to be is going to be your geographic location. So the front fan is going to be on the board closest to where the front of the computer is going to be. So your rear fan is going to be on the motherboard closer to the back of the computer. So where your port connectors, like your Ethernet and all that stuff, that's where it's going to be located. So that's why it's understand to know the orientation of the board when you're hooking up to them. So they may all be 4-pin fans. But sometimes you have a newer fan in a slightly older board, and that's where you run into the 3 pins versus a 4-pin connector, and you just plug it in and you're good to go.
Yeah, because I was looking at it, like it was all the same color.
Mm-hmm.
It was all 3 pins, and I just couldn't tell the difference until I looked at it.
Yeah, so it comes into physical orientation at that point.
Okay.
So yes, Cynthia.
I need to see it visually. So when we talk about the front, like the front fan and the rear fan, the front fan, it could be where the headers are, like in the area where like the USB and the fire and all the like the back end connectors are, and then the rear would be where closest to the CPU. I'm looking at it from like the actual architecture, like the CPU or the rear fan would be closest to where the Northbridge CPU area is.
I'll show you when we get on the actual physical board. So when we see an actual top-down view of a board, I will show you, and we'll, so you'll kind of see it.
Thanks.
But yeah, it absolutely has to do with your physical orientation. It's not with its orientation to motherboard itself. It's where its orientation is in the case.
Right.
So how it's like, if you're sitting in the case, let's get my annotator tool out here. There we go. So here's your CPU. Tower sitting up vertically. Here's your power cords coming out of the back. This one's obviously got a swelling problem in the middle. You got your Ethernet cords, all that kind of fun stuff. Here's the front of the, front of the computer. So front, rear. So internally, you have the motherboard inside of it, all its fancy little components. The front fan will likely be along this edge. You'll see like a little connector right here for the front fan. So somewhere along this end, it's going to be physically close to the front of the computer. Rear fan, probably be somewhere around here. Each motherboard manufacturer is different. You just got to look, and it's going to be closer to the rear. So this would be your front fan. This would be your rear fan. They're physically located closer to those points. So that's how they're going to be set up.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. All right. So here you got the 4-pin Molex. See this on older floppy and optical drives, things like that. And then on your newer hard drives, you have the Sata connectors, and they are identifiable by their kind of L shape of the connector itself. And typically the cords for the data, the data parts of the SATA connectors will be red. So the cables themselves will be red. Obviously, there are exceptions to this, but predominantly they will be red. The connector itself will be L-shaped, so it's easily identifiable that way. Front panel connectors, save the best for last. All right, these fun little connectors would be like the lights that you see in the front of your computer that light up when your internet is connected, when the power is on. This also is the connector for the power button itself. All the things that will connect that motherboard itself to the physical case near the front. It also could be internal speakers in the computer case, all that kind of fun stuff, all here in the front panel connectors. And you may see all of these hook up to your front panel pins right here, and multiple pins can go down in this one little box here. I will tell you right now, this is one of the most frustrating pieces on a motherboard to most people when they interact with it. It's the least straightforward. You have to very much pay attention to the schematics of the paperwork you have and looking at the writings down below. So like if you see all this little scribble work on the motherboards, everything on a motherboard is labeled. However, they are very nice to make sure you are not able to read that stuff on the A+, or a lot of times in the lab, you can't either. So you have to pay very close attention to schematics to know where the pins need to go. These connectors need to go on these particular pins. And make sure, Mark is saying it, make sure the plus and the minuses are in the right position. So yes, Stephen, do you have another question?
Yeah, so we'll be going over how to read that, because like when I was doing it, it was just like power here, and then there was a power on the right side of it, and I was just kind of about which front panel connector we're going, meaning they had the both same PWR like set power.
Not the same.
I was reading it
Not
wrong.
the same.
The motherboard specifications actually shows you at the bottom, like the panel, so you'll know exactly where you're supposed to put the power for the LED and the HDD and the speakers and so forth.
Yes, I'm saying because there was like a power connector, then was a power LED connector.
Yes.
So like the way I was reading it,
you just answered your question. You had the power and power LED. So one of them would go to an LED light to let you know that power is on, right?
Yeah.
And the other one would probably go to the power button.
Cool. Gotcha.
So one is the physical button that you're pressing. The other one would be the LED light that lights up to let you know that power is actually running through it. So But like I said, always pay attention to your documentation, especially in test out. They love their documentation in test out. And be sure to read, because a lot of them, they will give you everything you need, and schematics are important. So be sure, it's a big hint so you don't rage quit on that particular lab. And then, yes, in real life, they actually have on the motherboard labels describing what everything is on the motherboard, so you can kind of figure it out pretty easily on a physical motherboard in real life. Schematics, it's kind of like a paper diagram or map of where everything goes. Yes, Mark.
For the IDE connector, I know you said for the SATA, it can be identified or be known as an L-shaped connector. What would be another identifier for IDE? I just want to make sure.
It is okay, so you have the square shaped connector, right? Now, the actual cable that comes out of the IDE is going to be a flat ribbon. So it's going to look like that. And it's like each wire is going to run through that ribbon to connect. So it's not like a thin cable. It is flat, like a ribbon. So you'll know that is a PATA or an IDE or a floppy drive connector at that point, or a hard drive connector. These are the older hard drive connectors will use these. Don't run into them a lot nowadays, but you do still occasionally.
Okay.
So a big square right here. They can be blue, they can be cream, they can be green. So it'll be an IDE, PATA, or floppy connector. Any other questions? All right. All right, here are the back panel connectors you will see on most computers. We will get into these a little bit more. Right here in red, you'll see are the eSATA. Please take note of the E, which stands for external. So it's going to be a slightly different connector. This would be for external hard drive. So eSATA for external. So if you just see SATA by itself, that means internal only. Then you have these little arrow-shaped connectors, which are your fire wires. The all familiar USBs. Your network port. We'll go over all these in more detail, but just kind of showing them to you. Your audio connectors, including fiber audio right here, a little box at the bottom. And then you have USB 2s, which are black. You have the display port, which the display port kind of has this little side notch. It goes like this. So it has like a little cutout on the side. So that would be a display port itself. Then you have the DVI, HDMI. They don't have the DB15 on here, but we'll see that one going on a little bit later. And your USB 3.0, which is that light blue, your Ethernet, and then your audio connectors as well. All of those are physically attached to the motherboard itself. And then they go out the back of the computer. So if you need to know where the back of the computer is on the motherboard, look for these connectors standing up, and that will tell you where the back of the computer is. All right, questions?
Why are there 6 audio ports? Is that
well, they have, what was it? You had audio in left and right, audio out left and right.
And a microphone.
Microphone. They have one that could be for headphone, and then they have this, which is the fiber optic audio. For you audiophiles out there that actually have exceptional hearing, I do not fall into that category. I would not know the difference.
Well, it's usually like if you're like an audio engineer and you could use like a coaxial, but the fiber you get better quality. It's just yeah.
I have a buddy who does it, and he can pick up all that little nuance change in the sound. I can't. I don't have that good of hearing. So I was like, yeah, it's still sounds like drums. You know, it's still a guitar. I can't tell the difference if they're in an auditorium or in a on a stage. It just doesn't register. So all right. All right, here is a more top-down geographical location or map of a motherboard itself. We can see right here would be the oriented towards the rear of the computer. So these are going to be your connectors for your external input-output peripherals. Your case fan for the rear likely will be right here. It's a little 4-pin connector. Case fan for the front would likely be somewhere along here. Can't see it. But you see your 20-pin connector right there. And it will either be 20 pins or 24 pins. Your CPU socket right here where your chip would go. Based off of this socket, what manufacturer of chip would we be using?
AMD.
AMD. Why?
Because there's no little pins, and usually the pin is on the AMD versus the Intel. It's flat. Meaning the right. If I explain that correctly.
So we have a bunch of little tiny sockets here for pins to go into versus pins for the chip to sit on, right? So AMD, very good. So the CPU has its own fan. So the connector for that would be somewhere right around here. A lot of times it'll have its own power supply for the CPU, which will be somewhere in this area, but we will show that a little bit more. Here's your old Pci slots. There's about 5 of them hanging out here. So we have that. We have our AGP or advanced graphics. And then we have our RAM banks here. And then our IDEs, 2 of them up here. Yes, Cynthia.
For the front fan, is it right? You see where the AGP slot is? Would it be that little blue to the right of it? Would that be
possibly? I can't get close enough to tell, but yeah, okay. it possibly is in that neighborhood.
Okay.
But we know it's going to be, you know, on this side of it because this is going to be the front of the computer.
Okay, good. That's what I needed to differentiate. Thank you.
So based on the form factor of this motherboard, what family of motherboard do you think this would be?
An ATX.
ATX. Very good. Julian out of the gate in chat as well. So, yes, this would be an ATX. We can tell because of its rectangular shape, and it has at least, you know, 4 PCI or PCIe slots, and then it still has the old school AGP as well. Questions so far? Yes, there is no PCIe slots on this particular motherboard. It only has PCIs, which are the cream color, and then the AGP, which is brown. Although it appears to be black on this one. So this would be an older board. And it has its DB15 right here. Anybody know what this big pink one's for right here? What would we use that for?
Printer.
Printer. Serial port. Old school printers. Okay. You break out the randomizer here. And here's where I want to remind and encourage Don't be afraid to get it wrong. I don't,
It's an oppor-
go ahead, Mark.
Oh, it's an opportunity to learn. You
Exactly.
get it wrong, it's an opportunity to learn. Don't worry about it.
Don't be afraid to get it wrong. I'd rather you get it wrong dozens of times here, so long as you get it right on the exam. That's what I want to see, the learning process to happen. So up first for number A, Jessica, can you please tell us what letter A is, please? If you can see, it comes down, it's pointing at this right here.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for that.
Color. What color is it?
It's like that beige. And I can't use my notes.
I would prefer not. Just
No knowledge.
because we're trying to push ourselves here a little bit.
PGA, I think it is. What's the acronym? AMD. I do not know.
Would you like to phone a friend?
All right. Tuna has an idea.
Yes, about Baptuna.
You're on mute.
You're muted.
Oh, is it PCI slots?
You are absolutely correct. It is the Pci slot. So that cream colored Pci.
Yeah.
Very good.
Mhm.
Thank you.
All right, next. Tunisia, can you please tell us what the letter B is, which is right here? They're being a little bit mean with the colors. All right. Tunisia, can you tell us what B is?
I'm not sure.
We're going to try to take a guess. It's right here. So we just found out this one here next to it, A, was a PCI. So what do we think B might be? You can always phone a friend if you're having too much trouble with it.
It doesn't matter who.
No, pick someone.
Glean.
This Glean is looking. What do you think, Glean? What is that one?
I'm going to say Pci X.
Not quite.
Not quite.
But on the knocking on the right door, I will say that. Maftuna?
Is it PCIe?
Any more information?
What?
Just a little bit more information on that one.
The small version of the PCI.
Robert's trying to help out in chat.
Robert?
Oh, boy.
So Robert's helping out in chat on that one.
Yep.
So by one, PCIe by one. That's the short one. So I always know that one because it's really, really short. All right, next. Go with Karen. Can you please help us out with letter C? It's this big, long blue one right here.
Is it a memory slot?
Not a memory slot.
AGP slot used for radio. Blues. Oh.
Okay, Looking at my note. I want to phone a friend. Someone help me out.
PCI.
Someone, anyone, please.
Is it the AGP slot?
Not AGP, not AGP.
So
What color
another
is the
PCI.
what color is AGP?
It's blue and black.
AGP is brown.
Oh, bro.
Typically. Brown. Let's see here. Julian had his hand up. What do you think, Julian?
I was actually going to say AGP too.
Okay. We're still in the connectors area, so it works. Glean?
I think somebody answered it.
Simply said it.
16.
PCIe by 16. Melinda had it in chat.
Yeah, exactly. So
S16.
So PCIe
PCIe.
Express, PCIe Express by 16. And we know that because it's a very long connector here. Now the cream color, why they did the by ones in cream, I'm not sure on this one. I believe the one you'll be looking at on the A plus is going to be black and white, so you won't even be able to use the colors, I think.
So to help me to make a better connection or better understand this, PCIe 1X is like for what, micro DIMMs or for small?
You could use them for like, no, not for micro DIMMs. That would be for like sound cards, stuff like that, like a NIC.
Oh, okay.
May go into PCIe by one.
Right, and then so then the PCIe 16 are like what, for the graphic cards?
Yes.
For the, okay, all right. Now I feel better. Okay, thank you.
And there is a PCIe by 8, although those are kind of rare. All right. So next we are on to D. Who can help us out with D? LaQuisha, can you please help us out with D? Tistao, can you help us out with letter D?
It looks like a connector.
Right here. Yeah. So it is a connector.
Yeah.
So those pinholes, what do they look similar to?
Power supply.
Power supply connectors. So what did I say? You would have the 20 plus 4. So what did I say? You would sometimes disconnect that 4 pin connector 4. I'll give you a hint. It's close. So
are we still on D?
We are on D.
Is the 4-pin fan connector?
That's the CPU.
It is the CPU power supply. So remember I was saying you would have a 20 or a 20 plus 4 pin connector right here, a 24 or 20 plus 4. Sometimes that 4 pin connector will actually disconnect from there and plug into your CPU power. Sometimes they'll actually have a separate power supply for or separate power connector for it as well. But that is your CPU power supply. So very good. Next, Sierra, can you please tell us what the letter E is? All right, Mark L. Can you please tell us what E is?
E is where you would slot the CPU.
Okay, so CPU socket. And based on that, I know it's a little tough to see. Can you tell me who the manufacturer of that CPU would be?
It's hard to see. It looks like there's pins there. So if it's pins there, it's AMD. If it's flat, it's no, excuse me, that's backwards. If it's pins there, it's Intel. If it's flat, it's AMD, but I can't tell without zooming in.
I'll let you know there are pins there.
Okay, great. If there's pins there, then that means it's Intel.
Intel, very good. So it is an Intel chip manufacturer for this particular motherboard right here. Excellent. All right. So for F, Sibley, can you please tell us what F is? Sibley, you there?
Memory slot.
Memory slot. Very good. And what would be the other name we would use for that?
RAM.
RAM. Perfect. Thank you. All right. G. DW, can you please tell us what the letter G is?
I think it's a 24-pin power supply.
That would be the power supply, yes. 24 or 20 plus 4. So very good. Next, Miyaza, can you please tell us what the letter H is? IDE. Very good. Thank you, Miyaza. Ronald, can you please tell us what I is? Ronald? Aster, can you please tell us what I is?
I'm not sure.
Okay, you want to hazard a guess? It's got 4 little tiny pins there. Cynthia's giving you help in chat. Be a 4-pin fan connector, typically for your front fan. All right, Joseph, can you please tell us what the letter J is? That is this little bank of 6 connectors here. All right. Joseph, do you know what that is? Maybe it's got little L shapes too.
No, I lost that.
Very good. Susan, saw your hand up.
Is that the SAT connector?
SATA connectors. Very good.
So for SATA, is it SATA or SAT? Because on the diagram it said SAT.
Well, it should be SATA.
Okay.
SATA.
Okay. Okay.
It's SATA or SATA, you know, depending on where you're from. So, potato, tomato, you know, same thing. All right. All right, Hunter, can you please tell us what K is?
That happens to be one of the ones I'm not really sure about. Yeah, I don't even have a guess for that one.
It should be very, very familiar and remind you a lot of the letter H.
Letter. Oh, yeah. Okay. I was wondering. I was like, it looks just like the what is it, the IDE or something?
That's exactly what it is. It's an
Okay,
IDE
so it's just,
or a
it's just the
floppy
second
drive.
one. Okay.
Yeah, that's all it is. It's the second one.
All right.
They try to trick you, I guess, with the color. I think the H1 would actually technically be a floppy drive one because that would be near your drive bays. And then K would be an IDE, which would be closer to your hard drives.
Okay.
So, all right, next. Glean, can you please tell us what L is? Letter L.
And you said that this was the one that was going to give us the most problem than any other part of the computer.
Yes, many a student has developed an eye twitch with this particular one. Yes.
That's the one. All right. So it's also bad for questions as well. All right, because I forgot the name of it.
All right, well, phone a friend.
All right. Let me go to my boy Stephen Cruz if he can answer this.
There you go.
Front panel connector?
Absolutely. Nice job, Steve.
What is it called?
The front panel connectors.
Front panel connectors. Okay.
So front panel connectors. It's a bunch of little pins. That's basically how you connect your motherboard to the casing that it's sitting in. Only 2 more to go. Miss Melinda, can you please tell us what the letter M is? M is in Michael. It's this little box right here. Again, not expecting perfect answers. This is, the first time we're covering it in class, so we did read about it. So
that's the USB because I've been looking around for it.
that is the USB connector.
Yes.
Man. Okay. Mental note. If you want somebody in your study group, Melinda's killing it.
Stop. Don't do that.
So that would be your USB connectors. Very good.
Good job.
All right. Next. Jerusalem, can you please tell us what N as in Nancy is? It'd be this one right here.
The battery?
That is a battery. What does it go to?
The power. Oh, CPU.
That's the CPU powers over here.
Oh, the PCI.
Think about it, it's like it is it's the lowest level of operating system on a computer. It's like the basic instructions for like your inputs and your outputs.
The RAM?
Not quite the RAM, I mean, but it will tell you where to, how to use the RAM and what kind of RAM's there. Like when you first turn your computer on, it's the first place it goes to start getting instructions. There was an older one, and let me just replace it with a newer, fancier one.
Oh, I forgot the name. Oh, the BIOS, yes.
The BIOS is the Cmos battery, which holds the settings for the BIOS. So Cmos battery, CMOS, Cmos.
What was the other name for BIOS? Isn't it?
Uefi is the new BIOS version. But the battery itself is the Cmos battery, which holds the settings for the BIOS. Now, here's a fun thing for BIOS. You can actually set a password for the BIOS to secure it so that people can't go in and make changes. So that's one of those fun little things that you can set up, and I highly recommend it, especially in an enterprise setting. If you're going to have standard employees working on computers, password protect your BIOS, because if you don't, they may. So they may set, put in settings to and put a password on the BIOS so that they can put in their own settings and keep everything there. Yes, Cynthia.
That's for the more modern BIOS, or is that still
You can do it on older BIOS. You can do it on the modern UEFI too.
So, but also on the older version.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
So you can set up passwords to prevent people from going in and changing the settings. Because one of the things in an enterprise setting you're going to want to do is you're going to want to disable auto run on USB sticks, because that is one of the easiest way to get your systems infected is to allow auto run off of a USB stick. So you're going to want to turn that off, and you don't want an employee to turn that back on. So you would set a BIOS password to prevent them from going in. Now, if you forgot to do this, say, you came in and the systems were already out there and your predecessor did not set a BIOS password. An employee, a disgruntled employee gets terminated, and you got to go get files off the system or access the system itself. You go in and there's a BIOS password. Does anybody know how we get around that? There are actually 2 different ways we can get around a BIOS password. So those of you with some IT experience, what would be 2 ways to get around it? We haven't covered it yet. I'm just seeing if anybody knows it off the top of their head. We'll go Cynthia, then Hunter.
I don't work in IT, but I'm thinking just like reset it to old factory.
Well, you can go in and try, but that's still not going to relieve the BIOS password. BIOS password will still remain in place. So good guess. I like it. You can reset the system back to factory settings, but say there's files on there that you want access to, but you can't gain access because of the BIOS passwords. Hunter.
I'm just going to hazard a guess. I know when we talked about the Cmos battery, you said that if it died or you removed it, it kind of like, it kind of reset everything. If you remove the battery or replace the battery, will that?
That's exactly how you do it.
Okay, cool.
That's how you bypass it. Mark also got it in chat. Very good, Mark. So you remove the Cmos battery, that will reset all the settings and it will erase the BIOS password. So that will allow you to go in and reestablish all the correct settings in the BIOS. So that is one way. There is another way. There is a jumper panel. So there'll be like a little stick that's poking up out of the motherboard, and you pull that out and you stick it in a hole that's right next to it. And that in and of itself will automatically reset the settings on the Cmos as well. So it's 2 ways you can override a BIOS password. One is pulling the battery, because that erases all settings. 2 is using a jumper. That question will come up again.
Okay, would you please repeat that again, Kelly?
Okay, so if somebody placed a BIOS password that would prevent you from going in or making any changes to the BIOS or Uefi, the 2 ways you can bypass that or get around it is 1, pulling the Cmos battery, and which will reset all the settings, and 2, using a jumper, which is a little pin on the motherboard itself that you pull out and you push it into like a little hole right next to it, and that will also reset it. So you use a jumper or a Cmos, like removing the Cmos. Like I said, the jumper is like a little pin that is stuck into the motherboard itself. And you just pull it out and stick it into the hole next to it, and it'll say, Cmos jumper. It'll be labeled on the motherboard itself. So that's the 2 ways you can bypass it. Also, understand that that's how employees can also bypass your BIOS passwords, which is why so many CPU manufacturers put that fun little locking loop on the back of the computer. So you can put a physical lock on there to prevent them from getting access to the inside of the case. One of the first things you learn in cybersecurity is if they gain physical access to your systems, they own them.
Learn about some other security methods later.
Yeah.
For protecting your access to your computer, inside of your computer.
So you don't want them to have access to be able to pop that Cmos battery out, because then they can go in and update all the settings themselves if they so choose. So that comes to be a security measure that you would implement for enterprise settings. All right. Any questions? The jumper on the motherboard, Stephen, will be right next to the Cmos battery. So it should be right next to it. Can't see it on here. on the motherboard lab in test out, I believe you can see it. You can zoom in close enough to see the jumper. But it should be physically close to the CMOS battery itself. All right. And we have the opportunity to try it ourselves. So I'm gonna pause the recording. So here's the answer key. It's also in there. If you do the student paste and you go back through it, there'll at least be a answer key for you to go back to if you wish for the previous diagram we had.
How do you take a screenshot again?
Of which you'll have the student paste ones in Slack. It'll be there.
Oh, okay.
So, all right. So maintenance checks for motherboards. Whenever you open up a computer, you do want to do some basic maintenance check. So if you ever open it up and it's caked with dust, you want to go through with the canned air to blow it out, or they actually have specialized PC vacuums that do not allow for static discharge. So you want to blow out any dust or debris that's inside the computer if you ever open it up. You want to check for chip creep because as things heat up and cool down over time, when they heat up, they expand. When they cool down, they contract. So over time, if a component keeps heating and cooling, it will slowly migrate. So it's called chip creep. So over time, these connectors may not be firmly seated or seated properly. So you will start getting intermittent issues because the chip has moved. So what you do is when you open it up, make sure everything is still seated properly as you're going through it. Because if you're opening it up already to do some basic maintenance, like change out a CMOS battery, you might as well check a couple other things while you're already in there. So blow out the dust, check, make sure everything's still seated properly. That way it still has firm connections. Check your cables, make sure they're still seated properly, because sometimes computers get moved around, they get banged, they get kicked, they get hit by vacuum cleaners. When the cleaning crew comes in, they're not always the gentlest when they're going through. People sometimes kick and bump their PC if it's under their desk. I mean, these things happen. So we want to make sure all the cables and connectors inside are still firmly connected. So we'll go ahead and make sure on that. Again, we're already in there. Might as well do some basic maintenance while we're there. All right. Periodically, it's a good idea to back up your BIOS, especially before you do a firmware upgrade or something along those lines. Checking for firmware upgrades. You want to check the manufacturer's website, see if there's been any security upgrades or what have you with regards to your BIOS or Uefi. As we continue to state, be careful when flashing the BIOS, because what happens if something goes wrong? If we get a power flash while doing our flashing the BIOS, what happens?
Expensive paperweight incoming.
Expensive paperweight. Very good. I still have a Wii U as a reminder of what happens. I had a power disruption while I was flashing the BIOS on that sucker, and it became a brick. So just some basic things to bear in mind when we're talking about maintenance checks on our BIOS. Now, if we're going to install a new motherboard, obviously our first step is going to research the type of motherboard we need or that we want. Is it going to work with the components and CPU we already have, or are we going to have to upgrade everything? So we want to make sure it is still compatible with the components we have, unless we're doing a full upgrade of everything. So we need to do our research, read the documentation, verify the form factor will work with the type of case we have. Checking the CPU socket, chipset, power supply requirements, make sure everything we have will already work with what we're trying to get. Also, taking in mind cost, because typically in an enterprise setting, IT isn't necessarily given an unlimited budget. We are typically given a very limited budget and told to do the most with it we can. So we want to make sure we're not breaking the bank on it. And then the number of bus slots and other connectors and slots and ports to make sure we have all the stuff we need to be able to hook up all the required peripherals for the jobs we're trying to do. So step 1, research. Step 2, installing the motherboard. So the steps to install the motherboard: first, confirm the right motherboard has been selected based off of documentation. Remove all components, then remove the old board. Install the IO metal plate. Mount the board in the tower. Install the processor, then the RAM, then the components. Then you go to attach all cables, switches, power supplies, drives, all that fun stuff. Next, your PCI cables. Finally, attach your monitor, after you've closed it up, attach your monitor, keyboard, mouse using the IO interfaces on the back. Next, after everything's installed, you turn it on, brand new motherboard. First thing you're going to be prompted to do is go to your BIOS or Uefi. You need to update all your settings so that your motherboard knows how to talk to everything that is attached to it. So you're going to check your time and date, disable abbreviated post at that point so that it will do a full check after that. Set your boot order. Do you want it to go looking for a USB first? Do you want it to go to the optical drive? Do you want it to go out to a Pci server on the network to try to get a operating system? Where is it going to go to get the information it needs? We have to set that order. Ensure the SATA is enabled. If you have a hard drive that is SATA capable, save your configurations and exit. Observe your post, rerun it, observe your post, make sure no errors are present. Observe Windows starting. Then you would install your expansion cards and other drivers if needed to be able to have full functionality of all peripherals connected. After that, reboot the system as needed to make adjustments in the operating system or the BIOS if things aren't working properly. Don't worry, there's a lab and test out for this. All right. So BIOS settings and utilities. So inside your BIOS component information, you should have settings for your RAM, your drives, your CPU, all that fun stuff. There'll be built-in diagnostics and logs to be able to tell you issues that have come up in your BIOS configurations. You should have your boot sequences. You should be able to set up your devices, date and time, obviously, because that's going to be your first indicator that your CMOS has gone bad. Clock speed, because you can adjust clock speed if necessary. It'll give you information on the current bus speed that you have capable. And then your BIOS security, which is your passwords, encryption, secure boot, and LoJack. Also, on the monitoring side, you can monitor the temperature of the CPU itself, fan speeds, voltages, clocks, intrusion detection, because some of them will have a case sensor that will let you know if somebody has opened the case and tried to interfere with the internal components, as well as monitoring your bus speed. And yes, LoJack like the car. It is an older setting. It isn't really used much anymore, but it was a feature for a while. All right. Here is a look at what old BIOS looks like. Now, this looks very different than the Uefi we were looking at earlier, right? Uefi looks much more like modern programs, you know, like you could use your mouse and click on things. This is the old school BIOS. All things are selected using the arrow keys. The mouse don't work. It's old school basic input output. So it's going to use your most basic way to get around. So left, right, up and down arrow keys, enter, select, and then you can type in configurations as needed. They have a fun little scavenger hunt through the BIOS so you know to go look for things. Also in test out for those of you who might have been worried there wasn't a lab to mess around with it. So moving through, common pitfalls when installing your motherboards. Always, always, always make sure you have your ESD bracelet on it, or an ESD mat, or the gloves. You might say, oh, I've done it 100 times. Never had a problem. one time you do have a problem, it's probably going to be on the most expensive PC you handle. And then the immediate question after is like, why didn't you ground yourself? Because those mistakes can be very costly, especially if you're working on servers. Tie back long hair, again, Mark and I, not a problem. Always, any components you're handling with, you hold them on the edges and never ever touch the chips or the connectors. Because we don't want the oils on our skin to get on there because it can cause damage. It can cause oxidation or rust. Also, in the off chance that there is an ESD, this limits the possibility of it affecting those chips. All right, pitfalls. Don't ever use magnetized tools. Some of the cheaper tool sets will have magnetized screwdrivers in them for some odd reason. So best to check if it is magnetized. They have things you can use to demagnetize a screwdriver or just replace the screwdriver with something else that's not going to damage your components. Take extra care when tightening screws as not to damage the board. You don't have to really crank down on those screws to get them to set properly. It's generally like light hand, like finger tight and half twist usually is what it comes down to get a firm set on your screws in electronic devices. Be sure all screws are present with the boards. Usually 6 to 8 are present. Make sure you do a count as you're pulling them and then count again as you're putting them back in. And never force the motherboards to fit into the IO slot. They should have a template for you that come with the motherboard that you can replace so that it fits in there perfectly. My brother likes to say every tool is a hammer if properly applied. Not the case when working on computers. All right, common issues with the motherboard. Electrical burning smell. That means something went really wrong. Typically, unplug it at that point. Go in and check and see if anything has been damaged. Computer doesn't boot. Computer doesn't boot and beeps are heard instead. If you hear the beeps, got a post error. You can count the beeps, look it up based off the manufacturer, and you can see what that beep means. Although typically it was the most recent thing you were messing with, most common being RAM modules, because if those aren't seated absolutely perfectly, you will hit a post error when you try to boot. Buttons on the front panel not working. That means your front panel connectors weren't seated right. You got to go back in and check them. Motherboard lights up, won't power on, and hardware is not recognized by the BIOS. All right. Overheating typically means you have clogged fans or there's a lot of dust or debris inside of the computer. For those of you who are cat lovers, please don't let them behind your computer. They love to sleep back there because it's warm, but I can't tell you, I have opened up at least a few computers where it looked like a pillow inside of the computer. It was so packed with cat hair. Because they just love getting back in there and then the fan just sucks all that stuff in and doesn't blow it out and it just keeps packing in. So they had their computer overheating horribly. We opened it up and it was just like, I mean, it was almost like a folded cardigan sweater and it was just so heavily packed in there. So pet hair, which is why we don't store towers on the ground. People do it a lot, but you don't typically want to do that. Not enough power. If you're not checking your power supply versus the need of your components, you might get something that is not sufficient to power what you need. And that's where you might see the lights come on, but the board doesn't necessarily boot. Incorrect components installed, it may not recognize them. That's where the documentation comes into play. There are cases where it'll say, will this CPU work with this motherboard? And it'll be like, yes, and have an asterisk next to it. It may mean that you need a lower level CPU to upgrade the motherboard, so then you can now put the higher level CPU in there. So if you're doing a fresh build, you need to pay attention to that kind of stuff. Does the motherboard require an upgrade to be able to handle the CPU component that you're going to be putting into it? So out of the box, it may not be able to handle the components. It may require upgrades to be able to. Case buttons connected incorrectly. You will probably feel this in the motherboard app you're about to do. Check your hardware compatibility. And in the burning smell arena, remember those little batteries, the capacitors that are welded down to the motherboard? We'll look at, check all of those. If you see any of them swollen or cracked, that's a new motherboard right there. Rare that that happens, but it does happen. Got here. Quick time to climb, and then we'll be wrapping up. Everybody can join in. Quick little trivia. It's kind of like a Kahoot based off speed and accuracy. Go ahead and stop sharing for a second because I don't want you guys to miss out on the amazing music that I get to hear.
Top 40 hit.
Yeah. Bad thing is you play Kahoot long enough, you're like, man, this is a good remix. I like this one. All right, we can get at least 25. Well, two more. We got 34 connected. We can get two more. One more. All right, here we go.
Right, yeah.
Where is the motherboard configuration data stored? A lot of bears in this group.
Right.
There we go. 2, 1. How should the motherboard be handled? Hold it like a pizza. What cannot be configured in the BIOS?
Instagram.
That is a true statement. Snapchat's okay. If hardware is not recognized by the BIOS, it is most likely there is a short in the circuit board. True or false?
Last question.
All right, which is not a part of motherboard maintenance? If it involves soap and a scrub brush, I would say definitely that. All right, Hunter.
All right, Hunter, good job.
Twice in one day.
Good job,
Rachel,
everyone.
Karen, Julian, Susan. Congratulations. Nice work. All right, as we wrap up this particular session, we should now be able to explain the key role of a motherboard. We should also be able to describe and identify the components and typical interfaces found on a motherboard. Identify required maintenance checks for the motherboard. Remember the dust, getting the dust out of there, make sure we don't have chip creep, all that kind of fun stuff. And name the steps to installing a board using the BIOS to configure your motherboard. Identify common pitfalls. And just, in the end, describe how to solve common problems that come up with motherboards themselves. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, revelations? We are all now experts on motherboards.
A lot going on, isn't there?
We will have dreams about motherboards in our sleep and be like, yeah, I know that's an ATX. All right. Let's close it out.